when we talk about moving from the bottom of the plant up, now we're going to start with the roots. The functions of those are to anchor the plant, absorb and transport water into the plant, and with that water comes some dissolved essential mineral nutrients from the soil for the plant to use. They will store food that's produced in the upper part of the plant. In many cases, the roots are capable of doing that, if it's a perennial plant in particular. Also, roots are also a source of, or a place where certain essential compounds are produced or synthesized in plants, and then redistributed to other parts of the plant. Some plant hormones are produced there and some other compounds depending on the plant. They can also be a reproductive organ in some cases. We can produce new plants from them in some species of plants. If we look at some schemes of plants, the root tip here, I showed a photo micrograph of the root cap would be those tough big cells out here, the area of divisions back here, the elongations where the cells are increasing in size that have been developed down here. Then we'll also oftentimes have these cells near the surface of the root, the small root hairs, or small root, fine roots will have root hairs on them. Those are just extensions of some of those cells on the periphery that enable the cell or the root to have a larger surface area to take up water and nutrients in there. And then all those, root cells, or root hairs, I mean, connect back into the inner part of the root somewhere, into these cells. And they enter, actually the vascular tissue of the plant enters all the way down here. The vascular tissue of the plant carries all the way down to the root tip. And these root hairs intercept with that down there somewhere. Yeah?
Makes a bougainvillea's root so sensitive.
A bougainvillea's root so sensitive?
Yeah, why is it so difficult to plant one?
Some of them just don't branch well. Some species, they don't. The roots are damaged, they don't branch well, like the gentleman asked here. Some of them don't, some of them do. I can't tell you why, that's just the way they are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also on the root structure here, some plants naturally will form a taproot, some are more fibrous rooted. However, a taproot normally only forms readily on plants that are grown from seed. If a plant's grown in a container or in some way in that sense, usually that taproot is lost if it had one on it.
Will the taproot regenerate if it's broken or cut?
Probably not.
No.
It probably will branch, and that's why you lose the taproot. But it really isn't a big problem because most of the structural roots on a tree are going to be the top couple feet of soil anyway, so a taproot isn't essential.
Mustard
Mustard.
has a great taproot,
Okay.
and I've been trying to battle it on my property for a long time, and if I don't get the taproot, it sprouts new mustard next year.
Uh-huh.
So that's an
So-
example of a taproot that keeps on going.
Right, they have a growing point along the root that regenerates, right. That's exactly right. Some of the other weed species are like that too. Okay, real quick, there are adventitious roots too that develop, and those adventitious is a term that means arising from some other tissue. So an adventitious root is a root that arises from some other part of the plant other than a root. Do you think how that might occur? Have you ever seen that happen?
They'll come out of the stems.
Yeah, when you have a stem, sometimes you take a cutting of a plant from a stem or maybe a leaf, and you'll get the roots will begin to generate from there. Those are adventitious roots because they're arising from something other than a root initially.
Is an air plant an example of that also?
Could be, yeah. I think they probably are.
I wouldn't want to do it.
Okay, we finished roots. We're moving up to stems. And stems support the plant. They transport water and soluble compounds throughout the plant, up and down the plant. They are also capable of storing, storing some food produced in the plant. They oftentimes are responsible for having growth tissues and organs associated with them. And importantly, they have what are known as nodes and internodes, axils and buds. Okay? So we'll talk about those in this photo here a little bit. It's also illustrated in your book, I think. I can't remember the page. 7? 9, whatever. One of those pages in there. I know it's in there, trust me. Page 9, yeah, at the bottom there. So at any point along a stem where there is a leaf attached or a bud occurs, that point on the stem is called a node. All right? And the distance between any two of those is an internode. Okay?
Okay.
But and so that you'll hear those terms used. The internodes are very lengthy or they're very short. So there's tightly spaced or not very tightly spaced. The area, that point on the stem where the bud occurs, which may be a leaf attached and a bud in that little angle there, that little angle where the bud occurs is called an axil, A-X-I-L. So stems always have nodes, internodes, axils, and buds. Okay? If it doesn't have that, it's not a stem. It's some other part of the plant. Which may look like a stem, but it isn't. Stems also contain the vascular tissue, which enables the plant to move those compounds throughout it. And that vascular system reaches from the very tip of every leaf all the way down to the tip of every root and goes through the stem. And the components of the vascular system, there's two primary components. One is the phloem, one is the xylem. And in a dicot stem where everything's arranged in a circle, the vascular tissue we talked about, we're talking about the xylem and the xylem and the phloem tissue being arranged in concentric circles, where the phloem is outward, the xylem is inward, and they're separated by the cambium, which is the meristem layer. And some of the cells developed in the meristem, the cambium, some of them will become phloem, some will become xylem, and that results in the stem increasing in diameter when that cambium is functioning. In a real woody stem or a tree, eventually some of those xylem cells will become ineffective, or they basically die off and the cell contents are gone. It's just the cell walls. And that's the wood in the plant. I think it's a lot of lignin and cellulose goes into that cell walls, and it creates the woody structure in there. Okay?
When you're grafting, is it just the cambium that keeps growing, or does the phloem?
When you're grafting, you're trying to line up the cambium between the stem and the thing you're grafting on, the scion and the base.
So the phloem and the xylem doesn't necessarily keep growing or attach?
They'll eventually attach, but it'll attach because the cambiums grow. Okay. So anytime you have a disruption in the cambium, you're going to damage the stem. It won't be able to grow in diameter any longer. Anytime you remove when you girdle a tree or girdle a stem, you're basically tearing off, removing all the stem down, including the xylem. You're down to including the phloem, all the way down to the xylem. That's how you kill the stem, because if you remove the phloem, you're removing a significant part of the vascular system. And the phloem is important because it transports the food produced in the plant from the shoots down to the roots and throughout the plant. Because the roots aren't producing any food, just the food's produced in the leaves. So that process they have to move all the products up and down. If you move the phloem, the roots will, if you move the phloem on the stem all the way around, you're going to interrupt the supply of food to the roots. So they'll die eventually. The xylem conducts the water upwards from the roots all the way up to the shoots. So the xylem moves primarily in the upward direction, the material only upward. And the phloem material moves in it up or down depending on what's required in the plant. So the vascular tissue is located on the outer layers of the stems. The inner area of a real woody stem, a tree trunk, is dead wood. On the younger stems and shoots, you won't really have much wood. It will be almost all live cambium, or live xylem and live phloem in there. Okay, so these are I mentioned the phloem, or xylem moves water upwards and outwards. Along with that, the dissolved minerals go up. and the phloem moves in 2 directions. And in the xylem cells are kind of like, they're specialized cells, they're not those blocks, they're kind of like little tiles pushed together. And then they conduct the water up through the plant. This is how they look if you have a photomicrograph looking down into one of them, into a set of them. And this is just another schematic version of how they differentiate the xylem here and the phloem out here, separated by the cambium right in here. All right, just a schematic of that version. Now that's in a dicot stem, is how they would arrange themselves. In a monocot stem, they'll be slightly different. I'm going to skip over the next picture here. In a monocot stem, they're going to be individual bundles scattered throughout the stem, and within those bundles, this is looking at a bundle cut on end. These would be the xylem cells in that bundle. These smaller ones around it would be the phloem cells. If you see these on if you cut a palm trunk over in half and let it dry a little bit, sometimes you'll see those little dark dots in there. Those would be the vascular bundles in there. And then in between all those vascular bundles are just undifferentiated cells. They just hold water and some food materials in there. They're not conducting water or anything much in there. They may be full of water, but they're not moving it around. So they kind of act like cement. In a palm, those undifferentiated cells act kind of like cement, and those vascular bundles act kind of like rebar, reinforcing rods in there. That gives it the structural integrity in those plants. But this would be true in the monocots, the grassy-like plants. So they don't have a cambium. There's a little bit of cambial tissue in here, but they won't increase in diameter much. Once they reach like a palm, once it reaches a certain trunk size, when the plant is relatively small, that trunk diameter doesn't increase a large amount as the trunk gets older, as the tree gets older. It'll increase a little bit, but not a lot. It's reached its maximum size because the primary growth is in the shoot level, at the tips and at the roots, not in the stem. It doesn't have a true cambium in it. Is there a question?
That was my question.
Okay. And in phloem cells, in order to move stuff around, they have what's called a plate that separates them. Just for your information, kind of enables them to sort of like a valve to move stuff around. So things don't backflush, or they do allow it to backflush at times. And there's how a typical dicot might look, and with the different. These aren't cambium. These are layers of wood, and each one of these layers of wood had some xylem and cambium, or xylem and phloem in it. And now the phloem is primarily out here. This is old xylem in here, and the phloem's mostly out here. And each increment of growth on here is a layer of xylem wood then, when you look at the vascular, or the growth rings of a tree. Each year you put on a certain amount of growth, which gives us the annual rings. I won't get into too much of that, but it's the amount of xylem produced in a given year. Some years you'll have a lot, some years you'll have less. So the rings will be different thicknesses. Okay, we won't get into too much of that, but it does, how thick the cells are and all that relates to time of year, but we won't get too much into that. In tropical trees, they oftentimes don't have annual rings because they grow continuously. They never really slow down. So if they're growing in a tropical type climate in particular, you won't see very much differentiation in there.
So is the differentiation of the rings like a frost or something that like?
No, the cells that are older kind of harden off,
Oh,
and they just
okay.
they just color up because of the compounds that are stored in them. Okay, there's specialized stem modifications there's diagrams in your book. These are specialized stems, but they are stems, even though they may occur in areas of on the plant where you wouldn't think a stem is at. Okay, and we have buds on those stems, as I mentioned. That's another key piece of a plant, though. Another important structure are the buds. Those are immature, compressed, leafy, or flowering shoots. And in some plants, like this one, there may be more than one at a node. like in peaches and I think apricots. There's usually a couple, usually three, and one of those, sometimes they're usually mixed. Some of those will be flowers, and some of those will be fruit. Some of those will be flowers, some of those will be foliage buds.
Are buds and spurs the same thing?
Are buds and spurs the same thing? No, spurs are small, stubby little stems, and the buds are on there. We can have different types of buds. They can be terminal at the tip of the shoot. They can be lateral along the side of the shoot, or they could be in an axillary position where there may be if there's a leaf attached here, that bud along the side would be called an axillary bud or a lateral bud, either one. But those on the side are lateral, those at the tip are terminal or apical. And an axillary bud is a type of lateral bud. It's in an axil of a shoot or leaf. I mentioned they can be foliage or flowering or mixed. They also are arranged, different species of plants or different genera of plants normally. Different genera of plants will have the buds arranged in certain patterns on the stem. They can be opposite, where they're directly opposite on either side of the stem. They can be alternate, where one's on this side and the next node is on that side. And they could be, or they could be whorled, where they kind of spin around different positions around the stem. Okay? Or I should say they could be whorled, or they could be whorled, could be spun around, or they could be multiple planes, 3 planes or 4 planes around the stem. Like oleanders kind of has 3 and stuff. Elms in that family tend to have alternate buds. If you look at them, they kind of zigzag. So it helps with ID. If you know what bud arrangement is, you can somewhat narrow down the species to at least fewer. Okay, leaves is the next important structure. That's where all the food's manufactured in a plant, and where gas exchange occurs, and where water loss occurs. All the green tissue, most of the green tissue in most plants is in the leaves, although it can occur in other parts of the plant, but that's where it is. There's 3 parts or two main parts to a leaf. There's the blade, which is the flattened surface, and then there's the petiole, which is the little stem-like structure that usually is present that attaches it to the actual stem. And there'll be veins in there too, which are the extent of the vascular system out there. The xylem and phloem vascular tissue are the veins going out into the leaf. And they'll have a certain pattern to them, and you can, and plants can be kind of diagnostic, or be either netted or straight flag. We can have simple or compound leaves. Simple leaf means there's just one blade and one petiole. Compound leaf means that the leaf is divided into the blade is divided into multiple pieces with maybe multiple petioles on it. Think of a liquid amber leaf versus one that's maybe from an ash or a tepu tree or something like that, where you have a whole lot of little leaflets. All those leaflets together are one blade. Or in a tomato, the leaves on a tomato are divided. Remember that whole thing is a leaf with one petiole attached to the stem. Leaves have a certain structure to them. If we took a cross section through here and looked at it, there'll be a layer on the surface of cells that kind of is protective, an epidermis. And right below that are usually a bunch of these oblong-shaped cells that are very packed in there tightly. Those usually have the chlorophyll in them. The chlorophyll is the green pigment where food is produced. And that's what's shown here, with a lot of other loosely arranged cells. And then at the bottom, usually on the bottoms, sometimes in the surface, there'll be a little opening called a stomate, which is an opening in the leaf. It opens and closes. Daylight hours it's usually open, and that allows water vapor to escape. Water is lost from the plant. Also allows carbon dioxide to come in, which is essential to the plant. So these stomates, or plural or stomata, are located primarily on the bottom side of the leaf, but there will be some on the top in many cases. This is what they would look like in a photomicrograph. There's little openings here. Sometimes they stick up, sometimes they're sunken. And this is one in cross-section, or an actual one. There's little cells on either side that open and that control the opening and closing of that, and usually in response to daylight. Open during the day, closed at night. Those plants. And the important part here is the process of transpiration is water loss from plants. And that's occurring in these stomates. The xylems bring water out and it dumps it out in this opening in the stomate. So it's surfacing providing water to all the leaf tissue, all the cells in the leaf. We're getting water through that. And then some of that water empties into this chamber. These are water molecules here. They're leaving the plant by evaporation. It's 100% humidity in here. It's less outside. They're moving out. Okay? They're moving out of the plant. It's by evaporation. That makes sense? So that's how water moves in the plant. It's moving by evaporation, Mark. It's like a straw in a plant. That water is in the soil. The roots are connected to the soil and the water there. The vascular tissue is connected there. And as every molecule of water evaporates out the surface of the leaf, it pulls another one along, just like a straw. So that's how we get water moving up a 100-foot tree. It's moving up to the xylem tissue just by the pulling of one molecule to another. It's like you suck water up through a straw. It's the same process. The sucking is created by in this case, it's created by the loss of water molecules out through evaporation here. Yeah.
So what happens if a plant is overwatered?
If a plant is overwatered, what happens? Well, it doesn't really affect this too much. What it does is the roots require oxygen, and the roots will be damaged due to no oxygen. And when the roots stop functioning, they don't take up water, even though it's there. They can't physically take it up because they're damaged because they're not getting enough water or air because of too much water. So if you overwater the soil, it forces out all the oxygen and all the air, which plants can survive on that for a limited period of time. But when it gets to be days and days and days, it's a problem. I'm sorry.
I'm just trying to understand between stomate and stomata.
Stomate is one, stomata are plural.
Just plural. So
Yeah.
it's the opening and the space inside.
Yeah, this whole thing is one stomate.
Okay.
And when you have, these are all stomates along a leaf, in this case.
And-
So those are stomata,
Okay.
technically.
Right, okay.
The term stomates is used, stomata is more preferred, I think. I don't know. I'm not the Latin person, but
So if you have a bunch of plants in your house, you'll increase the humidity inside your house?
you could. Yeah, if you have enough.
Yeah.
The weather we've been having, you'd have to have a forest. But. Okay, flowers. One of the last parts of the plant we'll get to. They contain male and or female reproductive structures. Male is the pollen in the plant, and it's born on a, it's hard, maybe a little bit hard to see here, but the pollen sacs on the tip here, and then this stem is the filament. This is the anther. This whole thing is the stamen. Is the term for that. That's the male part of the flower. You notice this one has multiple things in it here. This one has looks like 6. No, must be more than 6. Can't remember. But how many petals are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a dicot. So there has to be at least 5 of these stamens in here, or stamens in here too. Those and the sacs on the end contain the pollen. That's the male part. The female part is called is made up of 3 parts: the stigma, style, and ovary. There's a schematic in your book that shows it. And the stigma is the very tip of it. The ovary is the bottom part where the seeds will be developed. And that ovary holds the newly developed seeds, or the developing seeds in it. And there's usually petals and other parts associated with it. It may not be showy, depends on the plant. Here's a schematic that shows it a little easier. This would be the female part. This is the ovuole or ovary area down here. This is the style out here. Or excuse me, not the style, the stigma, which is the sticky surface. The pollen needs to move from the male part here in the sac over to this surface here, and then the pollen grain will germinate and fertilize one of the seed, ovules down there to produce a seed. So a complete flower has male and female parts in the same flower. An incomplete flower would be one that's just a male flower or just a female flower, like we have on squash and cucumbers. And we can have, in some species, we can have plants that are, entire plants are just male or just female as well. They only bear male flowers or just bear female flowers. So we have all combinations. Open pollinated varieties of plants are generally developed on plants that have either complete flowers like this or have male and female flowers on the same plant like in squash. It's possible to have open pollinated varieties that way because all the pollen's contained within the same plant or in groups of plants. Yes?
Can you talk scientifically about what the bee does in its function?
Scientifically what the bee does?
Yeah.
Probably not, but I'll give a stab at it. Yeah, okay. Basically, there's various means of transmitting the pollen either from this anther over to here. And it depends on all the structures, how the plant is structured. It depends on the species. If you have complete flowers or separate plants, all that stuff. But some way that pollen has to get moved there, and there's various vehicles for that. One could be bees visiting to get the nectar that's down here. They brush against the pollen and they scatter it incidentally onto the female part, which is important in many plants for bees to do. That's how that gets done. It could be done by wind, is the other key method. And there's probably other insects that could do it too. But bees, when they pollinate, they're doing it incidentally by just brushing on the pollen here. When they leave, they brush on this, and they just distribute it that way. They get pollen all over them. Yeah.
And
That's as scientific as I can do it, by the way.
I could add a little bit. And
Oh, yeah, good.
when you see a cross-section of reproduction structures like this, and you notice that the anthers with the pollen are below where the stigma is, where it's sticky on the top, it frequently means that evolution is trying not to let the plant self-pollinate because you're not going to increase genetic diversity. So the idea is that the bees that would touch these anthers would fly away and touch the stamen
On another one.
on another one.
Yeah, it's unlikely the bee entering this type of flower would rub on this one. They'd probably but when they get to the next flower, they'd probably rub it going in.
Or water droplets or wind.
Yeah, or water or
Air
wind,
doesn't work.
Right. And and the point also is there's all types of arrangements of these flower parts here. Some of them will, these, instead of attaching at the base, they'll attach at the top. It's all combinations out there in nature. And that dictates how the fruits are formed eventually. Because when pollination occurs, which means pollination is simply the move of the transmission of the pollen to the female part here. And then once the pollination occurs, this has to be fertilized down here. The eggs have to be fertilized with that pollen grain germinating. And once the seeds are developing, then we have what's called usually fruit set. And a series of hormones are produced that enable that fruit to develop, and then we'll have fruit set. And this part of the flower will begin to swell and grow, in most cases, and develop a fruit, which will have a seed in it. That's the classic way it happens. But there's all permutations, so. Incomplete flowers is what I was mentioning. One of these parts is missing, either because it's on another plant or it's on another flower. Talked about that a bit, where there's separate plants. And then we get to the fruit, and there's all kinds of, in seeds, there's all kinds of these in horticulture in particular. You know, the nuts, this is actually the fruit structure in a nut crop. The seed, what we eat, the kernel is typically the seed or the part of the seed, a part of the seed itself. Not always, but part of it. And then we get down to the seeds, and these are really holding, in the seed there's usually there's a dormant embryo, embryonic plant part in there, which will develop into a seedling and a full plant at some point. And then the bulk of that seed, though, is usually a mixture of stored food reserves for that immature plant seedling to exist on until it gets some leaves established up above ground. So it has to germinate, sprout, and do all that growth without any food source other than what's stored in there. Okay? Okay, we're going to go quickly through essential plant processes in the next 20 minutes or so, and which will relate back to some of these structures that we talked about. But I mentioned that green plants can produce their own food, and that's because of a unique property they have in there that relates to the process of photosynthesis, which is the means by which plants produce their own food. They're able to convert the sun's energy into some useful form of biochemical energy, and then from that, essential compounds that enable the plant to grow and develop and function. Basically, what happens with photosynthesis is that there's simple sugars produced, simple carbohydrates, and those are produced from water that's taken up from the soil and from carbon dioxide that's taken in to the leaves through those stomatal openings that we talked about. Water goes out, carbon dioxide goes in. And those carbohydrates, those simple sugars, are the basic building block for all the plant structures and the compounds that are used in the plant, for the most part. This process requires light, the presence of chlorophyll, the green pigment, water, carbon dioxide, and usually some mineral nutrients are required too. To enable food products to be developed out of the photosynthesis process. So not bother you, don't memorize the chemistry, but just to let you know what's going on. Carbon dioxide is CO2, water is H2O. When those are present and combined in the presence of light and chlorophyll, the energy of light, chlorophyll enables the energy of light to break the bonds here between these atoms in water and carbon dioxide and enable them to reconfigure. We still have CO, and H in here. We have them recombined over here into a different substance, a different compound, which is a carbohydrate or a simple sugar, CHO. And then there's some water as well produced and some oxygen out of that process. But without these present, this equation wouldn't go forward without light and chlorophyll. Okay? That's what's unique to green plants. So carbohydrates produced by plants are essential to all the other organisms on the planet too. Do we eat the plants? Or something eats the plants and then we eat them, that kind of thing. So it starts the food chain there.
Hey, Dennis?
Yeah.
So, let's say I'm a laboratory in Ann Arbor somewhere, and I want to grow some food or some plants. Artificial light is the same as natural light?
So would artificial light work? Yes. It may not be as efficient because of its intensity or its color, but you could do it. Yeah, you could do it with artificial light. Okay, so that's photosynthesis in a nutshell. It's the Reader's Digest version. And respiration is another essential process, which is somewhat the opposite of photosynthesis. We have all those carbohydrates produced, so what happens to them? Some of them are further manipulated in the plant to develop cell walls, proteins, all the substances used in the plant required there. They become more complex substances based on those carbohydrates. And also carbohydrates combined with some of those essential mineral nutrients. But also there are some of those compounds, in order for them to be formed, there's other chemical reactions that have to occur in the plant, and those require energy. So some of the carbohydrates produced in plants are broken down, and there's energy trapped in there with those rearrangement of those bonds of carbon and carbon dioxide and water. The carbohydrate has a lot of stored energy in it because of that. If we break those apart, again, down to carbon dioxide and water, we'll get a release of energy that's important to drive certain processes in the plant. And respiration is the controlled biological breakdown of those carbohydrates with the release of energy and carbon dioxide. So it's breaking that back down again. And some of the carbohydrates in the plant go into this process. So it provides the energy used to maintain plants. This process requires the presence of oxygen, a source of carbohydrates, and usually some enzymes, which are specialized proteins. that enable this reaction to go forward. And the rate at which this occurs, the rate of this breakdown, is affected dramatically by temperature. Over a range of about 40 degrees, 40 or 45 degrees to about 95 degrees. As temperature increases, the rate of respiration increases too. So the cooler the temperature, the lower the rate. We get down close to freezing, it almost stops. We get up above 95, it kind of stops too, because things start to go weird in there, chemically, biologically. And so in this, simplifying this process, we'd have this complex carbohydrate, which is a complex compound. In the presence of oxygen and with some enzymes working here, it splits these bonds apart, and we get the simplified compounds back with carbon dioxide and water, and there's an energy released here when these bonds are broken. So we're going back to carbon dioxide and water. And there's this, what I call an energy cycle in plants then. Respiration's going on 24 hours a day within that temperature range, right? So the plants are always using up some of those carbohydrates. Photosynthesis is only occurring during the daylight hours because that's when light's available. And so the process of photosynthesis has to be pretty high during the day in order to satisfy all the respiratory needs of the plant during the 24-hour cycle. And if photosynthesis for any length of time becomes less than the respiration rate, then the plant's going to die. It may have some stored foods reserves in there. When we talk about storing food in different parts of the plant, we're talking about storing different forms of carbohydrates or more complex carbohydrates normally. So it can last on stored carbohydrates for quite a while if there's some available. But once those are gone, it's done if the respiration rate's too high or if the photosynthesis rate's too low. This is just showing where some of the things are going. Starches and sugars are complex carbohydrates that are stored in the stems or in the fruits. We have a lot of sugar in fruits. They can also be stored in roots in the lower part of the stems. And then they can be moved around if they're in there. They can be moved around in the plant through the phloem to satisfy needs of the plant. But we can use that process of photosynthesis, or excuse me, of respiration. Understanding that can makes us wise enough to know how to store fruits and vegetables. We refrigerate things, we freeze things. What are we doing? We're driving down that respiration rate, because that's occurring anytime we harvest a crop. Respiration is still occurring in that product because it's alive. So it's still breaking down, and if we want to have a nice fruit, we usually refrigerate many of them to reduce that process. Okay? We don't want that going on too fast, or pretty soon the apple's kind of shriveled and soft because it's starting to break down. I'll skip over that one. The other essential process I talked about a bit before with stomata is transpiration, the water loss from plants. And I mentioned how that's occurring because of that straw-like effect. And that is oftentimes referred to as the soil-plant air continuum. It's like a straw. Water in the soil, plant stems full of water, and plant tissue full of water, the xylem conducting that water, and then the air outside serving as a kind of what drives the evaporative process. The lower humidity outside drives that. So anything that disrupts this flow of water, if we damage the xylem, if the soil's too dry, if it's dark outside or the stomata are closed, then we would have this process slowed down. If it's a hot, dry, windy, sunny day and there's lots of water in the soil, plants will be pumping out like crazy in most cases. So it's affected, transpiration is affected by sunlight because the stomates are open the stomata are open in the sun. Temperature, relative humidity, wind, and soil moisture. You know, we get a warm, very dry, windy conditions, like we sometimes have in the winter with Santa Anas and so forth. Those plants can really dry down fast, even though it's maybe not really hot, but it's really dry and warm and sunny. It's ideal conditions. But this process is essential because it provides a mechanism for plants to bring up those dissolved essential nutrients from the soil with that water. And it also helps cool the plant on warm days or when the sun's hitting it, because it's evaporative cooling, just like a swamp cooler. So it is essential. If they don't transpire, plants are going to overheat on a warm day. The other thing about, just as a side, is that during the process of transpiration, some plants can emit what are called volatile organic compounds. And those actually, such as different oxides that are emitted, and those can actually, and organic compounds that can actually result with bright sunlight, can create some air pollution issues. And you hear about the Great Smoky Mountains in the east. That's largely due to development of ozone and other pollutants back there because of all the volatile organics coming off the forest back there in the summertime. That's how those come about. So it's possible for that to happen, although it isn't a reason not to plant things. I'm just saying they can contribute. There's a significant contribution of plants to some of the air pollution issues that are around the country, although man dominates most of that, but they do contribute some. That's showing water and mineral nutrient uptake, as I mentioned. Translocation is an essential process that we've talked about already, just to enumerate it though. It's the movement of water, food, or soluble compounds within the plant. And remember that water is moving primarily in the xylem, and these other compounds, food and other soluble compounds, are moving through the phloem up and down. And when we say things are moving around a plant, we say they're translocated from leaves to stems or vice versa. Okay? Questions about essential processes? It's like drinking from a fire hose, huh? All right. I'm going to go back there and I'll come back. Yes, ma'am.
With seeds, they respirate as well at a very low rate.
Yes, seeds are respiring at a very low rate.
So can you put them in containers that, if you do put them in containers that don't breathe, how long will they last or what will happen?
How long will they last if you store them in containers? Or it varies on the species and size of seed and so forth, but you're usually good for a season or two. And that's why you usually put them in a cool, dry place to try and minimize that. But there's very minimal respiration in there because but it isn't going on. And then when there's water present and right temperature, then they start respiring really quick and they start getting ready to germinate. So they use it up faster if the conditions are warm and moist rather than cool and dry. And then this lady here, I want to get back to you. Yes?
In growing conditions in the summer, like Alaska, where you have a disproportionate of sun versus nighttime, up there I've seen cauliflowers this big. And,
Right.
How does that affect, would those plants continue to thrive if that season were longer?
The question, I'll just repeat the question was in areas like Alaska where you have, in the summer, you have that really almost 24 hours of light. And she had seen large cabbages or whatever it was. Yeah, they get huge. She wanted to know if that process, if you had 24 hours of light continuously, would that occur? Probably within the normal life cycle of the plant. It wouldn't continue to grow forever probably, but I can't tell you when it would stop. But yeah, theoretically it could, yes. But normally they'll reach a certain size and then something else will develop a shoot or whatever. But if it never got, cabbage is a biennial, so if it needs to have a cold period before it's going to go and develop a flower shoot. So it's also temperature related too, not just day length. Over here and then back there. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if you wanted to save seeds and you put them in an oxygen-free environment,
Okay.
will they survive
Yeah.
without the oxygen?
Yeah, they'll just go dormant typically.
Leave dormancy, okay.
In fact, excluding oxygen is oftentimes used in post-harvest storage of apples and other things. They'll store them. That's how we get apples year-round here. One way is they'll put them in controlled atmosphere storage where they suck out all the oxygen and probably introduce nitrogen into it. So they exclude all the oxygen, get the temperature down around freezing, and it'll stay away nice for a long time. There's no respiration essentially.
When you were talking about the smoky mountain effect with the, is that the same thing as fragrance then? Is it the same process that we get fragrance?
It's a similar process, just different compounds though, oftentimes. Yeah. They're volatile compounds that are in most of the fragrances, yeah. Okay, I'm going to need to move on, but hopefully we'll have time at the end. Sorry. I know it's probably stimulates a lot of questions, I understand. I don't have all the answers to this. We do need to talk quickly about just kind of generic growth cycles and growth and development as it relates, especially to tie in some of these processes. So growth requires those things be present that are listed there, whether we're talking about a seed or a plant growing once it's germinated. But it requires light temperature, right temperature, amount of water, light, some food energy, and mineral nutrients present. But there are also compounds produced in the plant that are called hormones. We all have hormones. Plants have hormones, and they regulate many of these processes we talked about, including and also regulate growth processes in the plant. And the development of those, or the activity of those, one or the other, is oftentimes stimulated by particular environmental conditions. Day length, temperature, those kinds of things will trigger or stimulate the production or activity of one or more of those hormones. And that's what triggers the plant to respond in a certain way, because it turns on or off some of these processes that are essential, or slows it down. Okay? So that's kind of how the triggering mechanism works in plants. These hormones are produced, it varies with plant age as well. Sometimes they have to be a certain age before they're capable of producing them or have produced them. They're typically produced in one of the meristematic areas, could be the root or could be the shoot. And they're very effective at relatively low concentrations, doesn't take much of it. You know, the root stimulating hormones that you get with some of the powders or solutions, those are a type of a synthetic form of a plant hormone that are that triggers cells to develop into roots versus some other part of plant tissue. It's also important to remember that in most plants, growth may not be continuous, that most plants have some dormancy or low growth or no growth period, either during the course of the season or over the years. So it's not continuous. It's usually a response to environmental conditions that stimulate the plant to do that, and that may be controlled by hormones. As I mentioned, day length is the key. How plants go dormant in the fall here is largely triggered by day length. When leaves fall off of trees and so forth, it's triggered by day length. The shortening of the days will cause those leaves to subside and fall off, and the plant state of dormancy. Then it may require a certain amount of cold hours for that dormancy to be broken. So the regrowth is oftentimes stimulated by temperature. So years like this, we'll see things flush out and growth right away as soon as they go dormant, because they either never really fully entered dormancy, they never got cool, and the day length they had drops in the leaves, they never really got cool, so they never had to go into dormancy, and they never had to break dormancy. Meristems and seeds are very important here, because the meristems are what usually become dormant, or the seeds are the overwintering or the dormant, oftentimes a dormant state of some plants. They survive, the annuals survive in a dormant state as a seed in the seed form. And they require certain environmental conditions for that seed to regerminate. Also, apical dominance is important here, because apical dominance is a function where usually the shoot or the meristem at the very tip of a shoot or a root dominates all the other meristems behind that. All the lateral meristems that might be back there, the buds or along that stem, will be dominated by that. And until that apical meristem is removed or damaged, those lateral ones will either not grow at all or grow very slowly. So when you prune a hedge, you get all that lateral growth on the shrub. You're removing the apical meristem, which has the dominating effect on the other ones, and that's where those begin to flush, and lateral growth gives lateral flushes on there. That's how that occurs. Okay. trying to see what else I got left here. I want to talk about a few structures here physically before we end. So I'm going to kind of stop there for the moment. And we need to talk about these things that are really important. Can we get the lights up a little bit more? You have? Okay, so we're going to talk about, we talked about plant parts. And I think as a horticultural student, you need to have some appreciation of horticultural commodities that are linked in here. So here, pulling out of my hat, some carrots. So what part of the plant do we normally think of eating when we're eating carrots? The root. Okay. Why is it a root? Why is it a stem or something? Or a shoot? Grows in the ground, okay. So what part of the plant, if this is the root, what part of the plant is the stem? Come on.
The green part.
The green part?
The green part.
Okay, what does a stem have to have on it? What are essential parts of a stem? Nodes, internodes? Okay, so I'll take off one of these green things on here. I don't see a node or a bud or anything on
Should have
there.
a petiole and a leaf.
Yeah, this is a leaf. This is a compound leaf. This is the petiole. This is the leaf blade. It's divided multiple times. So I still haven't found the stem yet. So on a carrot, it's right, if you trim off the tops, it's going to be just that little, it's called a stem plate, is the typical name is given. It's just that little transition zone between the root and the leaf. Leaves are attached. So there's very little stem tissue on this plant. You really can't even, you probably couldn't even divide it if you had a magnifying glass. You couldn't find it in there. Okay? But we have, these are trimmed, of course, a little bit, washed up. You have little root hairs on here. So this is root tissue. And you've got the conductive tissue up through here. A lot of phloem and a lot of xylem tissue in here. So that's the root. Okay? Okay, we're going to go with something else here now. So I couldn't find a full thing of celery, so I got some trimmed. This has been trimmed, right? Celery stalk you normally find. Okay. So this is what we usually eat. Big spot. What part of the plant's that? Stem. Why is it a stem?
Because it's not the root and it's not the leaf.
What does a stem have to have on it? Nodes and internodes. You see nodes and internodes here. This? This is the leaf. This is the petiole. You eat mostly petiole. This is the blade up in here. For the most part, it's trimmed off. And this is the leaf. There's no buds on here. So the stem is the heart of the celery, so to speak, that compressed area down here, buried inside, and to the actually part of it's trimmed off here when they cut it and remove it from the field. So we're eating leaf there too, and maybe a little stem if you eat the heart. Okay, what else? Lettuce. What are we eating in lettuce?
Bud.
What's that? Bud. It could be a bud, yeah, big bud, but. What's a classic bud we would be eating for horticulture? Brussels sprouts, yeah. That's really a bud. So if we get this thing unwrapped. So what are we eating here? Yeah, we're eating leaves. And again, the stem is, and here's the meristem area down here. This is the stem. This is the new shoot coming up. And again, the stem is largest, probably about right in here, and maybe a little bit below that was cut off. Okay. I didn't bring one. What do we eat when we eat a white potato, an Irish potato? Bacon potato. Root? Who thinks it's a root? Who thinks it's a stem? Who thinks it's a tuber? What's a tuber? There you go. Let's hear it again. Stem. What makes it a stem? Where's the node? The eyes, yeah, the eyes, if you look in the eyes there, there'll be usually 3 little buds in there. How about a sweet potato? Same thing, right? No? Yeah? I don't know. It's a root. It's a modified root, a sweet potato. There's not nodes along it. The stem end, so to speak, would be where the shoots arise on that. That's the node right there, where it's really connected. It's sometimes known as a tuberous root because it looks like a tuber, but it's actually a root.
So when you put it in a sweet potato in water and it sprouts, it's sprouting at the end where it turns from a stem into a root.
Correct.
Okay.
At that
And
end.
the potato sprouts all the way down the
It'll
entire.
the old way was to propagate potatoes in the garden, or white potatoes. You just cut them into seed potatoes, so-called seed potatoes. You cut pieces out with an eye in it, you get a new shoot.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Bell pepper, green pepper. What part are we eating? Okay. Yes, that's right. And we cut that across, and what do you notice about that? Is this a monocot or a dicot? Dicot, monocot? Why is it a dicot?
When it sprouts, it has 2 leaves on it.
Okay, that's one reason. How can you tell from the fruit if it's a dicot?
There's
Oh,
4.
It's in the 4 sections. Yeah, this is the ovary on the plant, okay? And the flower, parts of a flower are going to be multiples of 4s or 5s too. So these would be the 4 chambers that the ovary was divided into. It developed, there was a small flower, and then when these ovules were fertilized and became seeds, the production of proliferation of tissue there, hormonally driven, and forms this nice fruit.
Isn't there a way to tell if they're male or female by the bottom part? I read something about that.
Male or female? They don't have male or female peppers.
Really? Okay.
What the flower on a pepper is male and female.
Okay.
It's a complete flower.
Okay.
Somebody was pulling your leg, I think.
I guess so.
Okay, so we can talk about a lot more products there, but we're out of time. So we're at the witching hour here, right? 11:30.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we could have talked about a lot more stuff. But I want to give you the highlights. I hope you gained some insight. And somebody threw me a. Where did this come from? Somebody threw this at me.
Somebody throwing things at you? At least they're not
It
tomatoes.
was a tater. This is the seed potato.
Oh, sweet potato.
Seed potato.
Oh,
It's a,
seed
or
potato.
a fingerling, or whatever you want to call it. A small
Oh,
white
fingerling
potato. You can see on there that if you look at it, you can see these little divots, the little eyes on there. Those are the nodes. Okay. You store them in the garage too long, what happens? Yeah. There you go. They sprout, huh? Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. You've been great. I'm sorry we didn't get probably all your questions answered, but I hope we stimulated you a little bit with some information and give you some insight on the important things that you carry forward in your training. Have a great training period, and I'll talk to you later.